Welcome to SportsLit. I'm Neil Acharya. Today's guest is Tim Cherry. He joins us to converse about the Don Cherry story, written by his daughter, Cindy Cherry. It was released on April 21st, 2025. Don Cherry's story has been well told, and there have been several books written about his life. The earliest goes back to 1982 when Grapes, a vintage view of hockey with Stan Fischler, was published. That was the year he began the segment Coach's Corner on Hockey Night in Canada. As we all know, that first intermission segment lasted from then until November 9th, 2019. Don had been getting to hot water from the start, with his entertaining and controversial takes on the game he made his life in. First, as a player in the minors, primarily in the original Six era, and then coaching in the NHL with the Boston Bruins and Colorado Rockies. As we also know, it wasn't all about the game. As time moved on, his segment shifted to topics away from the ice. On November 9th, 2019, Don Cherry went about his usual Remembrance Day in which he honored veterans, spoke about the World Wars, and promoted poppies. Promoting poppies could involve questioning those who either forgot, didn't know, or chose not to wear them. This time, he said the following. I live in Mississauga. Very few people wear the poppy. Downtown Toronto, forget it. Nobody wears the poppy. Now you go to small cities, you people that come here, whatever it is, you love our way of life. You love our milk and honey. At least you can pay a couple of bucks for a poppy or something like that. These guys paid for your way of life that you enjoy in Canada. These guys paid the biggest price for that. For obvious and justifiable reasons, he caught heat, as he should have. It wasn't the first time Don Cherry crossed the line, but it was the last for Coach's Corner. 2 days later, on November 11th, he was fired by Sportsnet on Remembrance Day. The world in which Don Cherry could get away with saying something like that, as over-the-top entertainment, had changed. Technologically, demographically, and culturally. This is where it gets interesting, and this is essentially the basis behind this latest book. Firstly, Poppygate, as it's described, is addressed. The argument is that what happened is more nuanced, and that Don Cherry not wanting to say sorry is not where it ends. In fact, he was going to address it in his own words. That was the important part. Cindy addresses the words of his detractors to describe her dad and has created chapters to address why these descriptions don't apply, basically challenging the assumptions of whatever box that people want to put him in. They are listed, for example, as xenophobic, ? Misogynist, ? The French, and more hot water, which tackles other controversies. The strongest case Cindy makes is in the case of him being labeled a misogynist. She writes that it couldn't be further from the truth, and cites him being an early champion of women's hockey, basically allowing little girls to attend Rochester Americans youth camps in the 70s. That same decade, he allowed the first female hockey reporter hired by the New York Times, Robin Sherman, to enter the Boston Bruins dressing room to cover her stories. She is on record for saying he's the first NHL coach to make that possible for her as a matter of policy. He was also a big champion of women's hockey in Team Canada as they played world championships and then got into the Olympics with the rest of the countries. In other chapters, the assumptions about Don are challenged using his personal relationships. He can't think X about a certain group because he knows person Y or people Y. While this may not be enough to convince the average person that her dad's not filled with hate, it does tie into the idea of him putting opinions and beliefs aside when it comes to dealing with people on a personal level. 2 sentences struck me when reading this book. Cindy writes of Don, he speaks his mind but has no malice. 2, sure he can be judgmental, but common sense prevails when it comes to his friends, of which she points to Mike Milbury and Ron MacLean. 2 people who she writes that do not share his political opinions and would be on what people would characterize as the other part of the political spectrum, let's say. And yes, we cover Ron MacLean. There's a chapter about him. So if you're still listening, the book is divided into two parts. The first half about the controversies, the second about his life, which is also part of my conversation with Tim. Now, you may wonder why I'm speaking with Tim and not his sister who wrote the book. Cindy Cherry, unfortunately and sadly, passed away on July 15th, 2024 at the age of 67, shortly after completing this book. Tim, who is a freelance producer and works with his dad on various projects, including their podcast that's ongoing, also, of course, the popular Rock'em Sock'em series, spoke on her behalf as he has intimate knowledge of the project, the writing process, and the intent. With that said, you can buy this book and any others on our website, sportslit.ca, as well as listen to all the interviews. And you can start listening to this one in just a moment. Tim Cherry, thanks for taking the time to speak today about this book. Welcome to SportsLit.
Well, thanks for having me, Neil.
I guess let's get right into it. There's a line in this book that I thought was really interesting, and it might have summed up what Cindy was trying to maybe get across. And you can let me know if you think that's the case. And in speaking of your dad, she says, Don Cherry, he speaks his mind but has no malice. Does that work?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think Dad came kind of from an era where you can say something and not be put into a box that you are that person, that type of person. Dad could disagree with somebody and then the next day go out and have a beer with them. I mean, when Dad was in Rochester and he was on construction, his best friend was Whitey Smith, who was a World War II veteran, and he started off as a buck private and had field commissions up to captain, and he was a real liberal, and he would be a real left-wing Democrat, but him and Dad got along great. They disagreed on a lot of stuff, and they would give each other jabs, but nothing that would ever break the friendship. So I think that's kind of an old school mentality, unfortunately.
Okay, and so I mean, later on too, I when talking about his friendships, Cindy writes, sure, he can be judgmental, but common sense prevails when it comes to his friends, and she talks about the small friend circle. So that kind of tie into the same thing, that maybe he has opinions as a whole, but when he's dealing with someone one-on-one, it kind of doesn't matter. He's going to treat that person with the same degree of respect he'll treat anyone else.
Yeah, Dad always kind of said he was a hockey player first, and one, and a construction worker 1A, right? And Dad spent 18 years in the minors playing hockey, and in all those 18 years, in the summer he worked on a jackhammer. Dug ditches and painted houses and did odd jobs and stuff like that. So, a lot of people said, oh, well, it's kind of weird that Don Cherry relates to the common man. I guess that being a common man, a laborer. Mm-hmm. But Dad lived that life for a long time. And, I think, Dad can be a bit, he is a bit judgmental. But, the funny thing is the one thing he's most judgmental on is, do you work? Like, what's your work ethic? And Dad always admired, I remember him leaving. I went to a game with him at Maple Leaf Gardens, and we laughed. And for some reason, we stayed kind of late. It was around 12:30, and we left. And the hot dog vendors were out there, selling. And I remember Dad saying, I really admire those guys grinding that out for a living. That's people talk about a tough job. That's a tough job doing that. And so, Dad, as I say, Dad's whole, a lot of the way he judged people was, do you work and your work ethic.
Right. So I'm going to switch gears, and just like I said before, the book is divided into two parts. It kind of deals with all the controversies, and then it kind of breaks. There's photos, and it goes into the next section, which is basically describing Don Cherry, the man. And some of that is what we've read in previous books. I think of hockey stories and stuff, and so on. So So here's the interesting thing, and I think anyone listening to this podcast is going to want to know this answer. And it's probably the most pertinent thing, I guess, right now when people think of Don Cherry in the last six years. So in regards to Poppygate, there's a line in the book that says, to me, there's no doubt, this is Cindy writing, to me, there's no doubt Rogers wanted Dad gone, so they backed him into a corner knowing he wouldn't kneel to their demands. I believe many in the corporate media knew there was more to the story about Dad's firing, but didn't bother looking into what went into the corporate narrative. Don wouldn't say sorry was what it was. So when the Rogers brass visited Don's home in Mississauga after November 9th, 2019, what were the demands beyond him saying sorry?
They were, I think that the biggest one was that they wanted Dad to read a pre-written apology. And I think that the people at Rogers knew that Dad wouldn't do that. I think that was right away was the first thing that they knew. I mean, I think, Dad kind of said, I got to go on and say, you people, I didn't mean immigrants. I meant you people who don't wear poppies, and maybe I should use a different. They said, no, you got to read this. I don't know, was a lawyer vetted or, a PR vetted thing. Dad looked at it, he goes, I don't even know half these words. And then the other thing was they wanted him to announce that he was taking sensitivity classes.
Right.
And then there was a couple other things. Then, it's just like when Dad and I talked about it, and then, Cindy and I were talking about it. I said, Dad, if they don't get you now, they're going to get you later. When Dad was in Boston with the Bruins, he actually got offered a contract. They said, Don Cherry got fired from the Bruins. What happened was Harry Sinnen gave him a contract, but there was a list of demands. And Harry did that knowing that Dad wouldn't. Harry didn't want Dad back. Harry Sinnen didn't want Dad back, and he put these demands in the contract, knowing that Dad wouldn't accept it. And when he thought about it, he said to my mom, either he's going to get me now, or he's going to get me halfway through the season. So just forget it. And I think that was kind of Dad's mentality. They're either going to get me now, or I'm going to say something 2 weeks from now, and everybody's going to be hypersensitive to it, and that's why Dad just said, forget it. I'm not going to do it. And Dad was. I said to Dad, I said, why don't you come out and say that? Like, why don't you come out and say, look, here's the deal. I want to do this, but they wanted me to, say I was taking sensitivity courses, and they wanted me to take that I had to do this, and then I had to do that. And Dad goes, I sound like I'm whining. I don't want to sound like a whiner. And that was a big thing for Dad. Like, I don't want to sound like I'm whining. It's just, I did something, they didn't like it. I got to take my medicine. I'm not going to whine about it.
So the idea that you just touched on it, maybe you can expand on it. So he did have the idea that he was gonna address it later on, like it was like maybe the next week on, like he was gonna address whatever was said. Was that the plan, I guess, in his head?
Yeah, I think so. Like it was like kind of what happened, and I think Cindy explained it in the book, was that so it happened on Saturday. My wife and I were leaving for New York that Sunday morning. So I called Dad Sunday morning, and I said, because I knew, like, timing's everything, and I knew at that time in society and in the media that stepped on a landmine. And so I called Dad up. I said, Dad, anybody? This was like probably 7 a.m. I said, no, there's nothing. No, everything's good. Why? I said, just a little. You said you might have got a little trouble. No. But by the time I landed, my phone was blowing. Was blowing up. So I think Dad, to be honest, some of the things that he said during Coach's Corner, a lot of the stuff was tongue in cheek that I think people kind of took as serious. Mm-hmm. But like, I think the Iraq War, I thought that Dad and Ron thought, okay, this is it. We're both going to get it. And some of the other things, but for kind of what he said, I thought it's kind of tame. Like, that's. People say it's a dog whistle. Well, one thing Don Cherry didn't do was talk in dog whistles.
Right.
And So I think he thought, okay, I got to go on and I got to kind of explain myself a little bit better. And even on the subsequent interviews at his house, he said, maybe I wouldn't have used the word "you people." I would have maybe used different words, but I do believe that we are not wearing poppies, and that society is forgetting, is forgetting the soldiers, and we're kind of losing our grip on our history. And so I think that's kind of what he thought. I think probably till about 3:00 on Sunday, and then things were just completely blowing up.
Who? I mean, maybe you don't have to name names, but how high up are we dealing with the people that came to see him from Rogers?
I won't mention names, but they were they were the tippy top.
So my next question is this, and I've wrestled with this, and it's not a question I had prepared, but now that we're talking about it, I've been thinking about it, and so I guess I'll try and get this out in a way that it sounds like a question. I guess the idea is that Coach's Corner makes a lot of money for the network, right? So for the network to cancel it, and then the argument be, hey, maybe they were making a bit like. Was it in their interest to save money to get rid of them, in addition to maybe looking like they were with the times? Is that kind of the?
I think if you look at the year leading up, like they got rid of Bob McCowan, who was their number one salaried employee, and they got rid of Nick Kyprios, and they got rid of Doug McLean, and they got there was some other people that they let go. Mm-hmm. So I think that might have been in the back of their mind, but I think that might have been column B, but column A was that they were getting pressure from social media, and they were getting, from what I was told, some pressure from the advertisers. Now, if that was true or not, I don't know, but that's what I was told.
And what about the league?
No, they didn't say too much. Like Gary Bettman gave a rather tame statement after. So, I remember one time when Dad was in, I forget which Olympics it was. And then they asked Dad about, there was that whole the French controversy where one of the bloc was saying that there was too many Canadian flags at Canada House,
right? And
they were all upset. And so they asked Dad, CBC asked Dad, what do you think of, I forget the name of the lady that said it, that there's too many Canadian flags and not enough, Quebec flags. And Dad said, well, they don't like our flag, but they like our money.
Right.
And there was a big controversy about this. So they had, had this big powwow, and a producer stood up and he said, Don Cherry's here for a reason, to give his mind and to spark some controversy. You knew he was good. You knew that was going to be something of his answer. So you either don't ask him, mm-hmm. or you ask him, and then when he says it, you have to let it go.
Right.
He says, you can't have a pit bull and stick your hand in, and then the pit bull bites you, and then you get mad. Right. So, that was like always the thing with Coach's Corner, was that a lot of people tuned in, I think for a lot of reasons, but a lot of it was some of the controversy. Right. And, that if you're making money off that, you're going to have to take some slings and arrows, both Dad and the broadcaster.
Right. Yeah. So okay. So you think maybe it was just a combination of, hey, they were moving towards making these cuts. It might have been, it was kind of getting into that area where he could have said something maybe he would have gotten away with in the past, and then.
I think it'd be a combination of the cancel culture movement was kind of at its apex. I think that Rogers saw this as a chance to get rid of Dad. Because I don't know if Dad's year was, he only had 1 year, contracts. Right. So, maybe they weren't going to sign him next year, and there was going to be that controversy for that. So this would have been a good time to cut ties with him. And again, I think the people who were running Rogers knew Dad well enough that what they were asking him to do, he wasn't going to do.
Right.
So you have to ask them, what was the underlying goal here, right?
And I imagine that since the book came out in April, am I correct?
Yeah, just before the playoffs. Yeah,
I'm imagining that is the question you're getting the most, right? I'm sure you've done several interviews, obviously by now. Yeah. I know I've read a couple. So is this the first thing that everybody's asking you about when it comes to this book?
Yeah, everybody kind of wants to know what happened and why. I think Dad's relationship with Ron. So I think that's that is a thing, and I think that's why Cindy wanted to write it, was because the one thing that did bother Cindy, and it bothered me as well, is like she said, there was people in the industry that knew what was going on behind the scenes, but yet Rogers came out and brilliantly came out with, Don Cherry won't apologize. We gave him the opportunity to apologize and he won't. End of story. And that was kind of the theme. Cherry won't apologize. And Dad kind of wore that as a red badge of courage, right? Like, yeah, never complain, never explain. But that kind of bothered us a little bit, saying, it should be a little bit more, Dad kind of did look to not that Dad cares, looked a little boorish, not saying, well, I'm not apologizing. But then again, as he said, I'm not going to do that because I don't want to sound like I'm whining, type of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
So in terms of I asked you about the questions you're getting, and these are all, Ron and the Poppy are a big one. Yeah. Have you, how has the media reception been to the book so far? Have you found people want to talk about it? I know in the book you mentioned a lot of or Cindy mentions a lot of, hey, there's certain outlets that don't want to cover it, or if they do, they're going to, you feel the angle will be slanted. I mean, how has it been for you so far?
I think, I know that this book would have been, like, Cindy self-published it.
Yes.
And that there would be no publisher that would touch it. Because Dad's a bit of persona non grata still. We were, and then kind of an example is, we started the podcast. Dad got fired on Monday. We started our podcast on Sunday. And, we would get, like, we're over close to 6.5 million downloads. And, we were getting, especially at the beginning of it, we were getting some really big numbers.
Right.
And there wasn't a sponsor that wanted to sponsor us.
Right.
Because of that. So I think that, the mainstream media and the mainstream thing, we knew that they weren't going to be looking to do this, but some of the other different outlets have covered it and things like that. So we knew it was going to have to be driven by social media and stuff like that. And, it hit the bestsellers list, and,
right.
It was bestsellers not only in sports biographies, but in biographies in general for 2 weeks and on Amazon's. So, it did well. We, and again, it's kind of that ground, that kind of grassroots type of guerrilla advertising.
Well, because you just mentioned it, and it was my next question, what is the current state of Don Cherry's relationship with Ron MacLean?
I think they. I think they don't see each other as much as I would like. Ron has seen Don a few times. Ron came over, not last birthday, but the birthday before he came over, and stuff like that. So they don't see each other much. I think they talked to each other a few times on the phone, but they were never as soon as the Stanley Cup was over, Dad said to Ron, "See you later," and he wouldn't see him until the first coach's corner next year. Like they never really hung around. I wish it was better. I mean, a lot of people, I don't get any joy of seeing people attacking Ron on social media. Dad and Ron were 35 years together. It's better than a lot of marriages. And they went through a lot of shit together, like a lot of shit that people wouldn't, and they both stuck up for each other. And I wish it was better. There's some extenuating circumstances, but I would hope Ron would still consider Cindy and I a friend, and Dad a friend as well.
Yeah, it's interesting in the book, right? Because there's a chapter called Ron, and it kind of explains. It is kind of because your dad's a complicated guy, right? In that he's very simple about what he likes, but it makes him complicated in a way. And at the end, I think the comment, there's a description of Ron, but then there's also at the end the kind of, what would your mom say? And she'd say, get over it, right?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. That's it. I mean, not to give too much of the book away, but Cindy and I felt that Rogers threw Ron under the bus as much as they threw Dad under the bus. There's no way if John Shannon was executive producer of Hockey Night in Canada, if Ralph Mallaby was executive producer of Hockey Night in Canada, if Scott Moore was executive producer of Hockey Night in Canada, that Ron would have had to go on Saturday night and did what they did. Those executive producers would have held a press conference, would have said, I'm firing Don Cherry. They would have taken the slings and arrows and protected Ron. And because Ron, if you look at Hockey Night in Canada, you look at assets. Ron's an asset. Dad was an asset. And then he became a liability. But he was Ron's an asset. And to damage your asset like that and not protect them, I think is inexcusable, really. I mean, I think it's inexcusable. They should have said, Ron, come on, say a couple of words, and, maybe even not have Ron on that Saturday and have him come back, say a few words and then go on. But to do what they did to Ron on the Sunday with Hockeyville, and then the Saturday was what was horrible for him. I mean, it was not something an executive producer or a company should do to an employee.
Are you sort of a conduit? Like, is your relationship with Ron still there versus like a conduit between your dad and him still? Yeah,
Ron and I sent a few texts during, here and there and stuff like that. But again, I'll if Ron needs to get something, and if he calls Dad and Dad doesn't pick up, or he's up north and stuff like that, and Ron sends something, I'll talk to Dad about it. But and Dad's 91, right? So he's pretty retired right now. So they won't be going out for lunch, because Dad doesn't go out for lunches or do anything like that anymore.
Right. Actually, it's interesting, and we won't give away too much of the book. You're right. But it is interesting. It's pretty specific rules that he did about, like, if you're going to go out for drinks.
Oh, yeah.
So
that's an old hockey thing, right?
Yeah, I guess I didn't know that. I thought it was interesting. So, yeah. So immediately after this happens in November of 2019, you and your dad still watch hockey. I know you're saying you're watching the playoffs together. I mean, yeah. I'm not sure if that was up until this season or just up until last season, but regardless, when he's watching and the first intermission comes on, that first time, I mean, would your dad normally watch intermissions, or would that be the time he'd step away? And what did he think when there's, there's first intermission?
When it first, it was kind of weird. What happened was, because when it first happened, I was still scouting for the Ontario Hockey League. And Dad used to love going out watching the kids. So I was go watch out U16 kids, but their kids about to get drafted into the OHL. So even when Dad was doing the coach's corner, he would come out, 2 or 3 times a week with me.
Right.
And so when the hockey started, when we started back up and Dad was doing, I think he watched the first coach's corner with Ron because he wanted to see what was going on. And then after that, I kind of made sure that I was out scouting and Dad would come. So we wouldn't really kind of watch the games as much. Yes. And because it was, I think what happens is, when the Poppygate happens and you're doing interviews and all this and the phone's ringing and then all of that kind of goes away, right? And then now you're kind of dealing with it alone, like you're dealing it without, not the public eye as much. So Dad and I would go out scouting quite a bit. And then the pandemic hit. right? So, and then the NHL stopped. So it was just this really kind of topsy-turvy little, 6 months, right? Like, so, and then sometimes when Dad comes over, like Dad's been coming over to watch the playoffs. So he's a big baseball fan. So, when he'll watch a little bit of the first intermission, but normally we'd switch on to the Blue Jays or who's ever playing. He's as much of a baseball fan on TV as he is a hockey fan.
Well, was it your grandfather who was a big baseball player?
Yeah. My grandfather, Dad's dad, he was voted the top athlete in Kingston the first half century. So from 1900 to 1950, and was a really good baseball player. And Dad was a good baseball player. He got invited to go down to the Brooklyn Dodgers single A team for a tryout. But he, an American pulled him aside and said, you can hit as good as the Americans and you can field as good, but you don't have the arm. You just don't have the arm. So stick to hockey. So Dad stuck to hockey.
Your grandfather is Del Marcheri, who Cindy's son is named after.
Right. Yeah. That's his namesake. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting thing, and just an aside there, is I noticed during the Four Nations, that's a time when you would probably expect, to hear someone like Don Cherry. And then he's obviously not on TV, and you could probably go to the podcast to hear him. But I found it really interesting, and I wonder if you, the Cherry family, noticed this, and I kind of picked up on it. Did you not notice that PK Subban has kind of become his own version of Don Cherry? He uses a lot of the mannerisms, the way he talks. It seems to me like he's just trying to channel that and to his own and model it with his own shtick.
I think I see that, but I think he's his own person. I think he was like that before. So people saying, "Oh, he's trying to be like Don." I think that's him. It's not an impersonation or interpretation. And I think like the thing like with PK, because he gets in a lot of trouble too. Like he gets in a lot of trouble. If you're going to be yourself and be authentic, you better have a thick skin. And if you're trying to pretend to be that, it doesn't work because you catch too many slings and arrows and it'll start to wear on you. And so you have to be true to yourself and they'll bounce off a little bit easier.
To me, what I find interesting, at least what it seemed like to me, is that it's not necessarily in the overall message per se. It's kind of in the delivery of how he's saying it. And I thought, I could see, because he's on American TV doing this, that they probably didn't see your dad as much. Like we up here could be like, hey, hold on a second, I recognize that. But they're like, oh, what is this? This is that was very interesting to me.
Yeah.
While I'm talking about how did your and I know you can easily stop me cold here and say you should have listened to the podcast, but obviously I had not on that episode. But what was your dad's take on the controversy of the Four Nations, the heated atmosphere and how Canada pulled it out?
Well, I think the funny thing is, Dad and I talked about it. I think what was the biggest story in hockey this year? And I think so far it's the 3 fights in 9 seconds. And everybody's got how great it was great for hockey. And when Dad did that 20 years ago, they called him a Neanderthal, a thug. It's a black guy for hockey. And I said, how things have changed. I said, when you were saying that, the people who were the same universe of people who are praising the 3 fights were the people that were criticizing you on when you would show a good fight. And even to that point where, now with the tariffs and buy Canada and, everybody's gung ho pro Canada, Dad caught a lot of flack from that when he was you're too much of a patriot or, you're too much of a nationalist and all that. But I remember Dad and I watching that in the first fight. We're kind of like, what the hell's, kind of caught you off guard. And then the second one and then the third one. And then Dad kind of said, they might have done that to throw Canada off a little bit. Like Canada was going to come out, full speed ahead. and then all of a sudden everything gets kind of, gets thrown off kilter and all that. And, the last game was pretty, that was super exciting. And Dad really enjoyed it. He just said, thank God it was Canada and United States. He says if Sweden and Finland got in, it would have been a complete and utter disaster. But
yeah, I mean, given the backdrop, it's certainly the tensions were heightened, and the game ended up being super intense, a super great game, and it ended in overtime, right?
Yeah. So no, that we watched it. It was quite exciting, lots of fun. I mean, it was, again, I think it's a little sad for Dad and I at times, because watching the playoffs last year, Cindy would come over after work and watch the play, like come over to my place and watch the playoffs with Dad. And so there was something definitely missing this year.
Well, I want to get to that in a second. And I wanted to kind of get to the reason Cindy kind of wrote this book. And it seems obviously that she's trying to balance the narrative, balance what's out there, I guess, and what you guys would consider mainstream media, to what she sees in her dad, and she gives examples. And so I wanted to ask you, and I think for me, it's not that surprising, but I think the average person may find this surprising. Cindy writes about how progressive, it's not a word that people use when they describe your dad, but how he's progressive, in terms of things like hazing, and with, women, like hockey schools in Rochester allowing girls to play. And I wanted to ask, obviously the first woman, Robin Herman, with the New York Times, coming to the locker room, he was apparently, as she says, the first NHL coach that allowed her to come into the locker room. What is that rooted in your dad's progressiveness in a way? Is it just back to the whole idea of that you think he might, the overall umbrella is one thing, but the way he treats people one-on-one is something else, perhaps? Is that like maybe
I that's a good question. There is kind of that funny, kind of dichotomy there of like the lady who was the first person in the dressing room, and kind of how that happened was that she said, Don, like, I'm missing this, and I'm missing a deadline. Can I come into the dressing room? And so Dad kind of said, well, if it's okay with her, I don't care. And it was more kind of trying to help her out, help her do her job and stuff like that. But I just think Dad kind of had I think Mom was a big influence with that. Mom was a big thing of get over it type of thing. And Dad looked at hazing kind of like Dad hated bullies and hated guys who would pick on somebody weaker or smaller, and saw hazing as that. He saw some during his career, he saw some awful injuries during hazing, and had a very bad taste in his mouth. And he stopped the Bruins for doing that after the first year. It was distasteful in his mind. So I think it's like lived experiences. Dad's very good about people putting himself in other people's shoes and saying, all right, how does that kind of work? And I think a lot of people say, oh, come on, that really? And that was, Dad, like, Cindy was mad one time that she was on a phone call with somebody who, struggled with English, and gave Dad, and she went over telling Dad, and Cindy, I remember Dad said, Cindy, remember this, she knows one more language than you. And so Cindy's going to put me in my place. Right. And so I think, it is that, and again, I think it's more old school that people accept you could be that kind of, have that different thing. And I think today, people want to put everybody in a box, and if you can't get out of that box, right? Like Don Cherry likes this, so therefore he can't like that. And Don Cherry doesn't like this, therefore he can't like that. And right. I don't think that he didn't. That's not a world he grew up in.
Right, and I think maybe, and if I can add to what you're saying, what I think you're getting at too is Don Cherry is like this, so he must also think like this.
Right.
I mean, so I want to ask you a little bit more about Cindy Cherry, your sister. Obviously, she passed just prior to the Olympics last year, or July. Tell me about Cindy, please, and then why, her and why she wrote this book, but her as a person.
Yeah, well, Cindy was Cindy was kind of like Dad. She was kind of a complicated person. She had kind of the at sometimes the aggressiveness of Dad and the brashness of Dad, but Cindy was very good at giving. She, only by the grace of God and Cindy donating her kidney to me when I needed a kidney transplant back in 79, 78, 79. And she donated her kidney. And if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be here today. And she gave back with, be it a pet rescue foundation that she started, the Rose Cherries Home for Kid after my mom passed. It was a palliative and respite care home that she did. And she was really good at volunteering and giving. And she was very, very much a cherry in the sense of that she would get upset when people would, I would say bad things about Dad, but just kind of like misinterpreting what Dad was saying. And I just remember, she was, I kind of helped Dad write his other books.
Yes.
And so I said to Cindy, you should write a book from your perspective of your life with Dad growing up. And I said, from a woman's perspective of what was life like in the minor hockey leagues. And she said, yeah, she said, I think I'd like to do that. She says, I think it would be a little bit cathartic for me. Mm-hmm. So she started to write. She did a great job writing, and she wrote so much actually that there's a part 2 coming out in Christmas. So there's another book coming out by Cindy. And she just, and anything that she did, she wanted it to be perfect, and she would go over and, and I'm not like that. Like, I understand sometimes it can't be perfect, and she'd be getting upset, and I say, Cindy, just relax. You know what I mean? Like, it's you're doing this. If you're not having fun doing it, don't do it. Right. And I think she had fun, but it was her nature to be stressful to try to get it right. And, she was one of a kind, that's for sure.
It's in the book she mentions and her tone does come across like your dad in the book, and she says that she's like her dad, and your demeanor's more like Rose Cherry, your mom.
That's right. Yeah.
So when she wrote this, being the first time she's writing a book, and in the book it does say she's done a whole lot of things, as you just mentioned. What was that process like? You mentioned that no publisher was going to touch it, so you went to Tellwell, I believe. Yeah. What was her process to not having written a book before? What was that like? Did she lean on you because you'd done stuff, and there's got to be at least 5 Don Cherry volumes of stories.
Well, I think like she kind of learned from what Dad went through. When Dad wrote his first book a long time ago, so we were still in Colorado, so it must 1980, 81. Dad was going to write it, and then it was going to be also by Stan Fischler. So he was a major hockey writer back then. Mm-hmm. So Dad and Mom Dad would talk into a recorder back then, like a Walkman, and then send a tape, and then they would write it. But Dad realized, they had Bobby Orr as a right-hand shot. They had Gordie Howe playing defense. So Dad knew the guy who was ever writing. It certainly wasn't Stan. Right. So Dad and Mom wrote the whole thing by hand. And then what happened was when Dad wrote his second book, there was people, well, you should say it like this, you should say it like that. And, the one thing that we learned was that, Dad's got to tell the book in his voice, even if it's not grammatically correct. And so, I think that Cindy learned that. I said, Cindy, it's got to be in your voice. And, don't worry, let Grammarly correct some stuff, but don't let it not end up being in your voice. And I told her, I said, I love Michael Palin from Monty Python. And a couple of years ago, I bought his book. And the first 3 pages of each chapter were fantastic. And I would say he wrote it. And then the book just was horrible after that. And I thought, there's no way he wrote that. The tone, the words, the pacing, everything was different. So, I just said to her, write it and I said, don't worry what people say. I said, you do this for yourself. And I think self-publishing was actually a blessing because I don't think they're as intrusive in the writing as if you went with a Penguin or something like that.
And so she had written enough by the time of her passing where there was enough for 2 books, and then you just after the fact pared it down into 1. Is that kind of what happened?
No, what happened was she had it done, and we were thinking of trying to get it out for last Christmas. And then they just said it was too big. So I think it was Telwell said, why don't you break it up into 2 books? So they kind of broke it up into 2 books. And so Cindy was kind of looking to finish the first, this one. And she had finished it maybe 2 weeks before she passed.
Oh, wow.
So it was done. And then, after a while, Dell kind of took the reins of it and just kind of, the process of getting it ready to be, for the company to take the book and put it up and get ready for printed and all that. And her son's good at that type of computer stuff.
Is it only available online, or is it available in stores too? Well,
surprisingly, Telwell got a knock on the door from Chapters, and Chapters wants to put it in a few stores. Now, the book and the DVD business, which we were, you have to be careful of guaranteed sales. So, they'll order, 1,000 books and then they'll sell 200 and they ship 800 of them back. Right. So I know that they're going to be a little cautious about how many books they have put out, but some of the stores are going to have it, but it's mostly print and ship from on Amazon.
Your dad also, because this podcast is a sports book podcast, and we like to get your dad's an avid reader, correct?
Oh yeah, Dad's huge reader. Even for his Father's Day, I got him. I didn't get him a book this time, but I got him a couple of magazines. One on the Wild West. He was he's a big Wild West Wyatt Earp fan. Actually, the last kind of vacation Dad and I went down to Tombstone. He wanted to, see the OK Corral and everything like that. But Dad's got a massive collection of books on Arctic exploration and like antique books and a lot of stuff on T.E. Lawrence, Lord Admiral Horatio Nelson, Drake, Sir Francis Kissinger, who went around the world by himself. Dad was really into naval guys. He liked Drake, he liked Nelson, and he used a lot of that mentality in his coaching from the books that he read. And so he's got a massive library of books, and he'd always have 1 or 2, but never fiction. He would never read. The last fiction he wrote was Two-Day Road by Joseph. I forget, it was a Canadian author, which is an excellent book. But most of the books are antique books.
I want to switch gears. I know I've kept you for a while, so I won't be too much longer, but I do want to ask you about the second half of the book, which deals with your dad as more of a person. And a lot of people that listen to this podcast may not know of your dad's backstory per se, as they wouldn't listen to another podcast. Yeah. So specifically, I'm very interested in who Jerry Patterson was.
Yeah.
And who was Jerry Patterson, and how did he help your dad elevate his career and business ventures?
Well, Jerry Patterson was an agent and a producer. He worked on different television shows. He was an agent. I think one of his clients for a while was Kenny Dryden. And so after Dad went to Boston, coaching Boston, then he went to Colorado. He lasted a year in Colorado. And was fired. And then he started doing Hockey Night in Canada. And back then, Hockey Night in Canada, you paid you $500 a shot. That was it. So you weren't making big dough on Hockey Night in Canada back then. So Dad, I think Dad met Jerry Patterson through Ralph Mellenby, who was the executive producer. And Jerry kind of saw the potential in Dad and kind of said, I think what we got to do is, we got to get you doing speaking engagements, and Dad made pretty good money doing that. And ironically, when Dad was in Rochester and he was coaching, and he was, kind of struggling. He was a construction worker. He got laid off, couldn't find a job, tried to make a comeback, eventually made Rochester Americans, and then eventually coached them, and then eventually 3 years later, he was in Boston. But during that time, he took a Dale Carnegie course on influencing people. Was it how to make friends and influence people? And basically, it was how to get up in front of people and speak.
Right.
And Dad just thought, he didn't know where his life was going, but he thought, it's a good thing to have. And he took the course, and then ironically, one of the things that Jerry wanted him to do was the rubber chicken circuit, kind of doing speaking engagements, and he hooked up with Dennis Hall and Red Story, and Dad hit all the highlights in little towns right across the prairies, and then eventually Jerry said, once we get you on Hockey in Canada, we got to eat 2 little boxes, and then we got to get you and do a radio show, and was very instrumental in kind of mapping out Dad's life and helping Dad find his way and steady his grounds and stuff like that. And, one time Dad did a speaking engagement, and Dad really worked on it about his philosophy on life and his philosophy on this, and got up, and Dad really worked hard on the speech, and Jerry, he said it. So afterwards, Dad said to Jerry Patterson, he says, "How'd you like that?" And Jerry goes, "Horse shit." He goes, "What? It's horse shit. People want to hear stories about Bobby Orr and Eddie Shore. They don't want to hear your philosophy on life." And so Dad goes, "Yeah, you're right. You know what? Everybody wants to hear Eddie Shore stories. Everybody wants to hear Bobby Orr stories." And that was the lesson, one of the big lessons that Jerry taught him. Yeah. And so Jerry was really a good guy. Really, kind of helped me in my career in television, and gave me a lot of guidance, and showed me some of the pitfalls and stuff like that. So Jerry was a great guy, and there's no doubt that he really helped shape Dad's career.
Yeah, I think some people may not know. I mean, a lot of people may know Don Cherry from Coach's Corner and know that he coached the Bruins and he associated him with hockey. And everyone knows Rock'em Sock'em of a certain age, but they may not know the the business ventures in the restaurants, that type of thing. And Jerry helped that. And it's Don Cherry's Grapevine, right?
Grapevine Restaurants, yeah.
Exactly. I think I remember one in Kingston.
There's one in Kingston. There's still a few kicking around. It's been a tough couple of years for the restaurant business.
It has.
But Jerry was one of those guys that, that Dad listened to and kind of took his guidance and stuff like that. And the funny thing was that from Dad being unemployed to being then unemployed again and not knowing really where his future was only 6 years. Well, maybe more than that, maybe 9 years, be less than a decade. So not having a job and not knowing what your future is going to be, that was still a really fresh wound that Dad still, could feel. And then he was, what am I going to do now that he kind of got blacklisted after Colorado? And so there was mom was a little bit nervous there too. So Jerry definitely was a godsend.
So I wonder, you talk about that 9-year period, and then it goes on for 30 plus years, and it kind of happens again in 2019, right? I mean, I guess at that point it's a completely different animal, but I wonder if there were any similarities, or if any feelings came up with your dad from those times when he, whether it was his something he did or not, but just being out of work.
Yeah, I mean, he, that was always kind of something that Dad fed off of. Like he always said, like, hunger, the biggest driver for success is hunger.
Right.
And he was in Rochester when he couldn't get a job, and then 6 months later he was coaching Rochester. Dad said, I was as hungry as you could. He goes, if somebody had to die on the ice for me to win, he says, look out. And then that whole kind of I think it was a little bit different when Dad got on TV because completely different animal, right? Like he kind of had to feel his way. And then Dad really got Jerry Patterson, and then it was Ralph Mellenby who really kind of shaped Dad and what he wanted him to do and how to act and stuff like that. And again, that Ralph Mellenby says he's the one to blame that he released Don Cherry on the Canadian public.
Well, speaking of, and just like Rock'em Sock'em, we could have a whole thing about that on its own. And for those that don't know, it's a yearly video franchise. It started out in 1989, and it was basically it would be like an extended Coach's Corner, but with a lot of fights and great plays. And it was a massive cultural hit across Canada. I was surprised to learn that the title of that came from your mom.
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, because like what happened was we did a thing called This Week in Hockey for sports something. It was like a fledgling sports station in Connecticut, of all places. And then the people who did quality special products, who did a lot. They back then, people probably might not remember, the older people like myself, they were all the people that did the compilation tapes. The hits of the 60s, hits of the 70s, best love songs, all those things. So they said, we want you to do one for Christmas. Instead of doing a weekly one, we want to do you one in a year. And we said, okay. And then, so we were thinking, well, what are we going to call it? And Dad says, well, we're going to have a lot of hits in it, and a couple, and we'd have a few fights because we had to pass everything by the NHL. So we only had 2 or 3 fights. And Mom says, well, call it Rock'em Sock, because, I had a Rock'em Sock'em Robots when I was a little kid, right? Let's call them Rock'em Sock'em Hockey. So Mom came up with it. Yeah, that's pretty catchy. And a couple of lawsuits later, we still call it Rock'em Sock'em.
I'll close by saying this. And for those that don't know, that there's about 30 installments, I believe, of that series. And there's a note in the book. I think it's the highest or the best rated or highest selling continuous series that in DVDs. I think it's a DVD, but I think that counts VHS.
Yeah, it was the highest running non-theatrical.
Yes,
non-theatrical series.
Yeah, in Canada, in Canada.
Yeah. So.
So you probably didn't think that at the time when you made the first one, it would do that, huh?
No. I mean, it was good learning, again, good business learning experience for me. We made some good money on it, but, we were dealing with a lot of people who were in the business to make money. So, I mean, it was fun. And I learned, definitely learned a lot about business doing it.
Here's my final question. We're in an era where people aren't going to kind of branch out and maybe take that step to maybe learn about someone they think they know about. So my question is, for those that don't know your dad at all, what do you want them to know about him?
It's kind of a funny thing. Like, people don't think Dad was kind of the same on Coach's Corner as he was at home, but didn't dress as nice and not as brash. But everything that Dad said on Coach's Corner, he believed. He believed it. He never kind of went on and said something that he didn't believe in. And I think that's why he lasted so long, because he could take the abuse. Now, again, some of the things he did tongue in cheek to piss off some people in the media and stuff like that. I'd watch and I said, oh, I know who that's for. And, sure enough, 2 days later, there'd be a Globe and Mail, there'd be a big article. But everything that Dad kind of did on Coach's Corner, he truly believed in it. And I think that, I think one of the reasons I think that Coach's Corner went so long as it did, it was as popular as it did, that Dad and Ron were be able to take it beyond the game, especially the game that night, which you seem to see now, that, Dad and Ron would talk about, Sidney Crosby, and then they would have a clip of, a girls tournament in Moose Jaw, right? And then, something happened, they would have the Soldiers, and it was, everything that Dad did was kind of from the heart. Like he really enjoyed showing the kids, on Coach's Corner, especially if the kids walked in with suits and ties and stuff like that. So I think, if I had to sum it up in a word, that was authentic. What you saw, he is what you saw. But again, when the cameras were off, he didn't dress as nice, and the volume was turned down a little bit.
Do you think there's assumptions from people about your dad that aren't necessarily true? Do you think this book is kind of for those people? Like,
Well, I mean, I think it is. I don't think the people will read it, right? The people that don't like that aren't going to read the book. But, I think it's for some people that do like Dad to say, hey, this is what kind of happened. And you might think Dad is like this, but he was like this, but he was also like that. Right. And kind of give them people a little bit more perspective on what Dad was. And again, in some ways, Dad was as a complicated person. In some ways, he's not. One of his favorite line is, "I'm fond of what I like," but if you were saying how do you sum up Dad, he was authentic. Like I remember when we were talking about, he did a commercial for Dominion Lending, and Dad was always, I'm not going to do a commercial unless I like the product or use the product. So we did one for Quiznos, and he did one for was it Ranger trucks, and then him and Mom did one for pink fiberglass and stuff like that. And Dad, I remember Dad going, he goes, I can't do that because I go, what the hell do you know about mortgages, Dad? He goes, nothing. And I says, well, then that's got to be the commercial. And the commercial was, hi, Don Cherry here. I know about hockey. I know about dogs. I know about good suits, but I don't know anything about mortgages.
Right.
And I think that people related to that. You know what I mean? Like that Dad wasn't trying to bullshit him that, okay, I'm going to tell you how to get a mortgage. Dad just saying, I don't know anything about mortgages, but these guys do.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Anything else to add, Tim?
I'm really proud of Cindy for doing this book. I mean, anybody that tries to sit down and write a book or write a script, it's easy to get through the first 10 pages. It's the next, 150 that's the hard part. And I'm really proud of her. It's a bit bittersweet for me because I know she really would have enjoyed being on the bestsellers list. And all the hard work she put into it, and some of the stressful things she got. I just kept saying to her, just relax. And if you're not having fun, don't do this. But she did such a good job, and for her not to be able to see the fruits of her labor is it's pretty tough. I mean, I'm so happy that it does well, but it's a bit bittersweet, and she just did a fantastic job, and it's strictly in her voice. When I read it, I can hear her voice in my head for sure.
Well, my condolences, and she does live on through those words in the book. So
right.
Thank you, Tim, for taking the time. And
well, appreciate it. Well, thanks for having me, and good luck with the podcast.